Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. In the last few decades, there have been a number of incredible players to come to the major leagues from Japan who have become household names. But you hear a lot less about players who go to play in Japan, who are known as Gaijins. Aaron Fischman's book, A Baseball Gaijin, Chasing a Dream to Japan and Back, follows Tony Barnett's incredible journey from the minor leagues to Japan and finally the majors. It's a great book full of interesting looks not only at what it's like to play in Japan, but what the Gaijin's life is like. I had a great time talking to Aaron. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Aaron. How you doing today?
I'm doing really great. I'm excited to talk about this book.
Yeah, it's awesome. I blew through it. It's a really fascinating story. So for those who don't know, what is a Gaijin?
Gaijin loosely means foreigner in Japanese, and it began with a derogatory connotation, but it's one of those terms that's kind of been embraced by the Gaijin themselves over the years. So there are 4 active Gaijin allowed per NPB roster at the Ichigun or the top level, basically like the major league level equivalent in Japan. And so those spots are scarce and you have to perform well to retain a spot, one of those 4. So there's a lot of pressure when you're brought in, and it doesn't necessarily matter how much they're paying you. They will demote you if you're not performing up to standards.
There have been a number of pretty notable Gaijins in the past. Is that right?
Yeah, there have been. And so more traditionally, it's a player at the twilight of his career. For instance, Andrew Jones was a Gaijin not that long ago. Kevin Youkilis, and that was kind of a failed experiment. He battled injury and was not very good. I think it was something like 22 games that Youkilis appeared in. Baby Shark, he was one from the Washington Nationals. And there have been a lot of more fringe players, but people that you would know, like Charlie Manuel, former Phillies manager. He was not a very good player in the major leagues, had a really short career, but he went to Japan and found success. He was really good and won some championships there as well.
So Tony's case is a little bit interesting. A lot of these guys you mentioned, they'd already been in the major leagues. Tony had not. He was on the steps of the major leagues, essentially, right?
Exactly, yeah. And just to go back to my previous answer too, Cecil Fielder too was one that a glaring one that I thought of that I should have answered. And that was an interesting case because he only spent that one lone season in Japan. It was actually with the Hanshin Tigers, and then he became a Detroit Tiger, and the rest is history. But he went to Japan in his prime, kind of like Tony, but very different background heading into the experience, as you just alluded to, because he had been in the majors with the Blue Jays. He just wasn't getting the playing time that he wanted to get and felt like he deserved. And so he kind of used that 1-year experience in Japan as a jumping off point, and then just had a tremendous career with the Detroit Tigers. So it was just a 1-year thing. But yeah, Tony was knocking on the door. He was in AAA with the Arizona Diamondbacks organization, the Reno Aces, and he led the Pacific Coast League in starts. He was a solid innings eater, and he was going to be called up to the major leagues almost definitely the following year, but he would have been considered a fringe guy, kind of like between number 26 and 30 on their roster, and just probably going to be called up if there was an injury to a starting pitcher or something like that. And of course, that was before the universal DH. This was in 2010. The reason I'm bringing that up is because National League teams used pinch hitters way more often. They were considered more valuable. So a pitcher like Tony, who was, say, a 6th starter or something, even if he was called up to make a spot start to replace an injured starting pitcher, he very likely would have been demoted back down. And so the lack of stability was really something that concerned him. And partly why the Japanese opportunity seemed so attractive to him. But to be completely honest, and Don Nomura, his agent, says this in the book, and Tony has admitted this to me a number of times as well. It was the money that was the ultimate drawing factor for him to leave for Japan in the first place, because he knew he was taking a huge risk. It's kind of that old out of sight, out of mind thing. When you're halfway across the world and you're not a Japanese player yourself, the MLB scouts are not really paying that close attention to a fringe major leaguer. They think, well, he left in his prime. He must have left for a reason. And maybe we'll check in a few years on him and see if he's dominating in Japan. But there was a real risk that Tony left, and after he left was not going to ever get that major league opportunity. But that's what this book is focusing on. And I think it's fascinating and cool that he was willing to take that risk. It wasn't easy for him, and ultimately it worked out in the end, but not at all the route that he expected to take. He never would have dreamed of spending 6 seasons in Japan and being so bad that first season where he was demoted to the minor league level, the Nigun level in Japan, and battling multiple major injuries to finally get that opportunity. I know I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but on the wrong side of 30 at 32. So I find it just a fascinating, inspirational journey that he went on, and I'm trying to take the reader on that as well.
Does he make this decision with the idea that he is going to end up in the major leagues someday, or is he just kind of taking it one step at a time here?
That's a really good question. It's a little bit complicated. In the back of his mind, though, he was, I don't want to say 100% confident, but he's a confident guy. He's not brash or arrogant, but he has this quiet confidence about him. And I alluded to that in the book throughout. He's a fifth grader in elementary school, and he's telling his teacher that he's going to be a pro athlete. At the time, he thought it was with the Seattle Supersonics, but he didn't grow enough. So he quickly realized that wasn't a realistic possibility. But throughout, he's had that confidence, even though he will admit he never was the best player on any one of his baseball teams, which I think is wild. I believe him, but I just think that's crazy, and a real testament to how hard of a worker he is, but also how confident he's been over the years in his abilities. But that said, even though internally in the back of his mind he had that belief, he did make the decision to leave the US and go to Japan, coming to terms with the fact that it is possible. And in fact, the odds say that he won't get back to the US and the majors. So he wasn't unrealistic about it. He knew that it would be a difficult path. But yeah, I do think he was pretty confident that he would get back. And again, he did not expect it to take 6 seasons in Japan before he did get back. And that sounds like I'm saying that in a bad way, but those 6 years ended up just being life-changing, and a time in his life that it also changed a lot off the field. He became a father in Japan. He used this phrase, he grew from a boy to a man, even though he was 26 when he left for Japan. It was just a transformative experience.
You knew Tony a little bit before he went to Japan. How did you end up meeting him? How did you become interested in his story?
It's a really interesting thing how this ended up unfolding. So I was an undergraduate at UC Davis in Northern California, not too far from Sacramento. And I was writing for a small independent website actually called davissportsdaily.com. And I was blindly reaching out to minor league pitchers. All I was looking at was guys who were logging a decent amount of innings and getting strikeouts, particularly people who have a good K to walk ratio. So I knew nothing about his personality. I had no idea that he would end up being so charismatic and opinionated and just just like a quote machine. But back then, it was on Facebook, on social media. He was a minor league pitcher, so there wasn't, I assume, a lot of demand to interview him. But also, I think people were just so much less guarded around media requests.
Yeah.
This was in the early days of Facebook and social media, and he just this was the spring of 2008, actually. So we've been in touch for a while, and he did a couple interviews with me, and they were transcript interviews. We didn't even talk over the phone early on, and then we did some phone and podcast interviews. And soon after that, a few years later, we kept in touch. He started writing blog entries for that same small website while he was in AAA. And then when he went to Japan, he kept doing it. And during the earthquake and tsunami in March of 2011, he was blogging for us.
Wow.
And that was just such a wild time, such a tragedy. So much happened, so much loss of life and property, and with the radiation concerns and them delaying the start of the season. Just it was just such a historic event. And of course, we were so concerned for the people over there and Tony and his family. But just from a human interest perspective and just curiosity, it was so fascinating to be able to get his firsthand account as someone there on the ground. He was in Tokyo most of the time, and he was in Yokohama when it hit. So he wasn't in the Tohoku region, but Japan was affected as a whole so much, of course. And so to have him be blogging about it, and I think he released a blog maybe 3 or 4 days after. I felt grateful that we were able to share that with our readers. And he was just so honest about everything, and throughout the whole process he's been so transparent, and I've been really grateful for that. That's made my job so much easier.
So he comes over there his first year. He doesn't know the language. He doesn't really understand a lot of the cultural ins and outs of Japan. How is he
hmm
treated there? How is his experience when he first gets there?
He was treated well within the organization, but and and the general public as well, but he kind of turned inward, for lack of a better term, especially when he started struggling, which about a month in or so, and didn't really expose himself to new situations where he was mingling with people or picking up certain cultural things by osmosis. He really was just from station to station. He kind of was just in his apartment a lot, going to the field, going to practice, and to the games. And he wouldn't really mingle a lot with the general public. He didn't like to bother his interpreter, Go Fujisawa, who became an amazing friend quickly, even part of the family, as Tony and Hillary often say. And an interpreter's job description in NPB and in Japan, when they're dealing with Gaijin players, it's described as 24/7, where
Hmm.
they're around the clock and they don't really have a separation of home and work life. But Tony was so considerate of Go's time when he was away from the field, and also just being prideful and wanting to figure it out himself as a guy in his mid 20s, and just not wanting to inconvenience Go. A lot of times he would struggle. I give the example in the book of him at a supermarket, and he can't figure out which type of meat it is. So he just
Hmm.
says, forget it. I'm just going to go to McDonald's, and just kind of backs away from that situation instead of tackling it head on and solving it. And I can completely relate in an uncomfortable situation with a language barrier, and you don't want to look stupid, and you don't want to annoy the guy that you work so closely with, and who's home at the time, and it might be late in the day or something. And so it wasn't that doesn't get exactly to your question about how he was treated, but it speaks to how uncomfortable he was early on, and the on-field struggles
Yeah.
really bled onto his lack of comfort off the field. And it's interesting how closely those two things were really related to each other. As he became better, much better that second season when he transitioned into the bullpen, he really felt like exploring, and that's when he and Hillary would go on those midnight bike rides and ride around Oyama Cemetery or go to the Imperial Palace. And that's where I think it got really fascinating, his cultural journey. That first year, though, there was a lot of video game playing with people back in the States or people playing overseas in other countries. And so it wasn't necessarily an antisocial thing. He was bonding with people from back home, but that was his sweet spot. He didn't really get out of his comfort zone as much as you really need to and should if you want to get the full cultural experience or even a part of it.
Did he have much of a relationship with the other Gaijin there? Is it a little bit of like a community there? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Aaron Guile was a big mentor to him. And I don't know if you or our listeners remember Aaron Guile, but he's played for about 5 or 6 years in the major leagues, splitting time between the Royals and Yankees. Much better known as a Kansas City Royals outfielder, left-handed hitter. And so he came to Japan later in his career. That's kind of like what I was talking about before, the more traditional route where players go in the twilight of their career. And so he's Canadian, Aaron Guile, but English speaker. And Jamie D'Antona was one of the other Gaijin on the team, Tony's first NPB season in 2010. And he was from the Diamondbacks organization, interestingly enough. And it wasn't exactly a coincidence. They kind of had a pipeline at the time from the Diamondbacks to the Swallows. And so Tony had never been Jamie D'Antona's teammate within the Diamondbacks organization, but he was familiar with him, and the feeling was mutual. Jamie knew of Tony as well. And so that very first day, Go Fujisawa got Tony from the airport and got his bags. They quickly settled in. But then right after that, and this is after such a long flight, and Tony's really exhausted and tired, but he's in the moment. He's doing whatever is recommended, and Go has they brave the rush hour Tokyo subway commotion, and they go to the Roppongi district, which has a lot of restaurants, and it's more popular with foreigners or gaijin, and they meet Jamie D'Antona there, and then Go leaves, and Jamie and Tony walk around that downtown area, and they start to get to know each other better. But that first season is disappointing, but this is the reality. Tony was up and down. He was demoted many times. And also Aaron Guile, at that point, that was the second to last season of his career. He started really having a lot of injury problems, especially back and neck issues. And so because of various reasons, Tony wasn't really with those foreigners that often. One of the other ones was Chang Yong Lim, the Korean closer, and so there's still, of course, a real language barrier there too. So what would happen would be Go Fujisawa, so he's the pitching translator at the Ichigun level, so that's the top level, or the major league equivalent, and then the Nigun level is the minor league level. A lot of organizations only have one minor league team, And so that was in Toda, the Toda Swallows. Um, so when Tony was demoted, he was all the way in Toda, which wasn't close to Tokyo. And so he was not near the other Gaijin that I just mentioned, and he was on a completely different schedule. He had to wake up at 6:30 in the morning and take the subway, then get a taxi once he got off at the Toda station stop, and he would get home at like 1 p.m. or something. Whereas the Ichigun players, the ones I just mentioned, when they were healthy, they would be starting their days at 1 p.m. and it would just be completely different schedules. So they didn't really see each other much. But what I started to say before I interrupted myself was when they were all at the Ichigun level, and this was more the case for Tony starting that second season onward, they would have gaijin dinners, especially on the road. So Go Fujisawa would be the interpreter for pitchers at the Ichigun level. Koji Kondo, who was Go's superior, was the Ichigun interpreter for hitters. So it would be often those two interpreters, and then the four active gaijin, and Nori Aoki, who was not a gaijin, of course, Japanese player who ended up spending time in the major leagues and then went back to Japan later in his career. He would join too, interestingly enough, a lot of the time because he always had major league ambitions. He was just such a phenomenal left-handed hitter often, and I feel bad for him because it's terrible when you have these expectations so high, but he would often be compared to Ichiro just because of his left-handed stroke and his ability to put the bat on the ball and get on base so frequently. But yeah, he had major league ambitions, so did Chang Yong Lim, and so they both knew that learning English would be a valuable asset in their career. So it was kind of a cool cultural and language exchange where Tony would be there. There would be one or two other Americans or English speakers, maybe Jamie D'Antona, or a little bit later Josh Whitesell, and also a little later Vladimir Ballantyne, who English wasn't his first language, but he spoke English well, from the Netherlands, and then Aoki and Lim and the two interpreters. So they did spend a lot of time, especially on the road at dinners.
After that first year, he has some ups and downs, but he ends up being a pretty beloved figure over there, it seems like.
David Watkins, the British English language blogger who's featured throughout the book, he speaks about it as a lot of gaijin over there are thought of as a hired hand, and it's kind of considered it's a temporary thing. They'll be in Japan or with that particular organization for a season or two. And so the fans, of course, demand results, and they want their highly paid gaijin to play well and really deliver on the field, but they don't become beloved, as you said. And Tony, just as he stayed there longer and longer, 6 years is a really long time to be in Japan as a foreigner, especially with a single organization. But that second, really the third season is what cemented it from my perspective and from talking to Tony, because that third season in 2012 is when he became a dominant closer. The catalyst was, I would say, though, the second season when he was moved to the bullpen, and there was a philosophical shift for him where he didn't have to pace himself as a starter. You don't have to save your bullets, was the quote that he gave me, and that's what his bullpen coach Tomohiro Ito told him. He really embraced that. His velocity started to increase. He was toying with a cutter, trying to emulate Mariano Rivera, and pretty quickly he got a pretty good cutter going. And then he implemented a splitter that third season, or at least more fully integrated into his repertoire. So he started throwing those two pitches that were virtually unhittable, especially that cutter they just had no chance against it. So all those things combined um, really made him excel on the mound. And so that was part of what the fans really loved about him. Of course, when you're delivering to that extent, the fans who are just baseball hungry and they just want to win so badly over there. They're so passionate. That'll do it, maybe. But the thing that really put it over the edge was how passionate he is, how demonstrative. When they would win a big game, he would just pump his fists like crazy, and the catcher would lift him up and hold him in his arms. And he hated the Yomiuri Giants probably as badly as the fans did, which you don't always see from a pro athlete. Sometimes it's a little bit more detached and, okay, this is my job and I'm going to the field to do it, but you don't see that unfiltered passion. And Tony, for better and for worse at times, is just such a passionate guy, so sensitive, and it's not always the most even keeled. He got way better at that over the course of his career, where if something happened, it wouldn't automatically derail him on the mound and just snowball into something bad. So he was able to develop that skill and that mental fortitude, but still, he just always just had that passion. And when things are going well, you knew about it. You just from looking at him, all you had to do was take one look at Tony, and you knew. So I think the fans really embraced that about him. And the prime example is when they eliminate the Yomiuri Giants in 2015 en route to the Japan series, which is the Japanese equivalent of the World Series. I think it's important to understand the full context. The Yakult Swallows are a long-suffering franchise, and less so in recent years, but I kind of think of it as like the Clippers and Lakers, both in the same big metropolitan city, Los Angeles and Tokyo, respectively, and two very different degrees of success. The Yomiuri Giants are often regarded as the Yankees of the NPB, where they had won so many championships and had so many historic seasons and historic players, legendary guys to come through that organization. And the Swallows barely had 500 seasons where they lost much more than they won. And Tony in particular was victimized by these Yomiuri Giants on the field. He had some outings where he was just giving up 9 runs, and early would only last 3 innings in some of those starts. And so from a personal and team standpoint, it culminated in him turning it around. And to cap off that perfectly dominant season by him individually, he was able to eliminate the Yomiuri Giants, force their longtime legendary manager to step down and go into retirement. He'd later come back, but he conquered his demons. The team that tormented him so much that first season, he was able to get the save that brought them to the Japan series, and he just went crazy on the mound, and it was just a great moment, and just shows how much the fan base really loved him and embraced him ultimately.
So you mentioned, he's there for 6 years, which is a pretty long time for a Gaijin. A lot happens to him. He ends
Yeah.
up getting married. He has a kid. He reinvents himself as a pitcher. How does he now
Mhm.
look back at his time in Japan?
He sees it as a huge positive and something that he looks back fondly on. He has so many memories, and even the first year, those struggles, it's just become part of his narrative and what made him what he is today, the loving father. It's just not that self-absorbed kid that went to Japan. I shouldn't say self-absorbed, but at that stage in his life, he was just so focused on his career and
Sure.
kind of tunnel visioned in that way. And he had this one goal, and he was going to do anything he could to achieve it. And he grew up, he evolved, and Tokyo really gave him that opportunity, and just the whole experience gave him that chance to show what he was made of, to be resilient, and to work through those major setbacks, the multiple demotions that I alluded to, the major injuries in 2013 and 14. And I think the injuries are really important to consider because it wasn't a through line from, okay, he's a dominant closer in 2012 to, okay, he's in the major leagues now a year later. It was interesting how that the contract situation worked out because him being so good and unhittable as a closer in 2012 resulted in him earning that huge 2-year, $3.2 million contract. And after he got that, unfortunately, were the 2013 and 2014 injury plagued seasons. And when he wasn't injured, either he returned too quickly and wasn't himself, or he just wasn't that good. And it more had to do with injuries. But for those reasons, even though he was mentally ready to go back to the US and get that first major league contract, and he was confident in his abilities, major league organizations didn't have any interest because his 2012 dominance as a closer was a distant memory, and he would have to prove himself again, which he ultimately did in 2015, leading the Swallows to the Japan series and setting the franchise record for saves in a season that Shingo Takatsu, former White Sox pitcher, held previously. He thinks about that time often, and also he now is an employee of the Yakult Swallows, which I think is pretty cool how it came full circle. He's a scout or scouting consultant for them based in Arizona and on the West Coast. So he's able to be that family man that he's always wanted to and spend so much time with his daughters, Madeline and Loretta, who are now 10 and 8 respectively. But he's still able to be around the game that he loves day in and day out, go to baseball games in the Pacific Coast League. And more than that, it's so fulfilling for him to have the opportunity to give these foreign players an opportunity to go to Japan and possibly have the massive success that he had. Most of them will not be Tony Barnett, where they're following that same formula, but he's giving them a chance. And he thinks that that's really cool and rewarding, that he has an opportunity to identify who's most likely to want to go and then present them with that opportunity. He doesn't make the final decisions, but he's watching closely these players, and he's reporting back to the home club in Japan, and he's on top of that, and he'll go to Okinawa for spring training every year. And so he's very much still in it, even though he's not living in Japan. It's still a huge part of his life.
So when he's 32, he ends up signing with the Rangers. How does he find that transition back into the States, playing over here?
First, of course, he's extremely excited to be getting the opportunity. And you know about his confidence that I talked about. He's just a supremely confident player and person in his own abilities. But one thing about Tony that's often served him well is he has a huge chip on his shoulder. And I don't know if the reality of the situation matched his perception, but he truly, honestly believed that players were doubting him and that they were looking at him a certain way. He used the term side eyeing. Guys were side eyeing me in the clubhouse. And he just felt like these teammates of his, especially in spring training, were looking at him like, okay, this is a 32-year-old rookie. He's never proven himself at this level on this stage in the US. He's coming from Japan, where the level of competition isn't quite as good. It is actually really good. And most people will say that they call it quadruple A because it's essentially considered a notch below major league level, but better than triple A. So he has this perception that people don't really believe in his abilities or trust him to deliver. And now I don't know if that's actually the case, that they really were thinking that, but what's important is that that fueled him, and he continued to outwork everyone, would be the first to show up, last to leave, and he left no doubt by his performance and his demeanor in the clubhouse and around the team that he was going to make the team. You never know until you know. So it was a relief when Jeff Bannister, the manager, called him into his office and told him, but he knew he was going to make it, if we're being honest. And um, still, though, he had to work hard. He had to work with Bobby Wilson, one of the catchers, and his and Doug Brocail, former major league pitcher, was the pitching coach in Texas at the time, and Brad Holman, former major league pitcher, briefly bullpen coach. All those guys he worked extremely close with, and he brought a humility to the table that I think was really important, because it can be a little bit jarring, or even you can get in your feelings a little bit when you're 32 years old. You've had so much success over the course of your career. You're not a rookie. Why are they calling me a rookie? I've succeeded on such a grand stage. I took my team in Japan to the Japan series. All eyes were on me. Why are they calling me a rookie? And he put his ego aside. He did what he had to do. He did the rookie chores. He would carry his girly bag to the bullpen every day. He would buy candy for the veterans. Adrian Beltre was in charge of some of these things, being the grizzled vet on the team. And it wasn't that hazing was so bad, but it's just they kind of treat you in a joking way, like rookies are supposed to be treated. And again, he wasn't a typical rookie. The other interesting thing too was, and we won't get too deep into his backstory, which is in the book, but Matt Bush, former #1 overall pick, was
Yeah.
a fellow 30-year-old rookie with him. So that's another example of someone who's not under 30, not in his early 20s like a lot of these other rookies, or younger. And he's right there with Tony, carrying the frozen bag from the clubhouse to the bullpen, and doing all these rookie tasks, and being humble about it. But yeah, there definitely were some adjustments on the mound. One thing is he started using his curveball a lot more, which he largely had abandoned near the end of his time in Japan, just because he didn't really need it, and the cutter and splitter were so dominant at the time in Japan. But in the US, reintegrating that curveball really allowed him to diversify his speeds a little bit more, because his other 4 pitches were all kind of around the same speed. So he was becoming a little bit predictable, especially against left-handed hitters. And so that was one thing in particular that I spoke with Brad Holman about. Tony was game for whatever. He was open-minded. He wasn't so resistant to getting feedback, even though he had been in professional baseball for a number of years by that point and had already achieved a great amount of success.
I've got one more for you. You got to do something recently that I have always wanted to do. I think it was at your first book event. You got to throw out the first pitch at a game. Is that right?
It was really cool at a San Jose Giants game, single A for the San Francisco Giants.
That's so cool. How's that whole experience for you?
It was a lot of fun. I honestly think I blacked out a little bit. I don't really remember a lot of it. And I was just kind of on autopilot. So I'll back up a little bit. So I did radio at UC Davis, KDVS 90.3 FM with Ben Taylor, who continues to be a good friend of mine. That was as an undergrad, back right around the time when I first got in touch with Tony Barnett. But Ben and I have been good friends over the years, and he presented the opportunity to me to have a booth at their stadium at Excite Ballpark, where the San Jose Giants play. And early on in the process, he asked me to throw out the first pitch. This was many months ago, maybe even almost a year ago. And like an idiot, I said, no, that's okay. I think I would be nervous, and you should just give it to someone else. He didn't revisit it with me, and I guess he knows me well. He sprung it on me an hour before, And I didn't get nervous because I had so much stuff to do. And I was having really good conversations with people at our booth, and people were purchasing the book. And it was just so thrilling to me to finally be talking about the book to people I didn't know, complete strangers who loved baseball and loved reading. And it was just a tremendous experience. It was Dia de los Churros, and they always have those churros that are really good. I had been to a
Mhm.
game years ago there, but it's cheaper. They have it, I think, every Saturday night. Also, Camilo Doval bobblehead night. He
Wow.
spent time with the single A team in 2019. I'm getting into all this minutia just because it was just such a tremendous day and night being there. And when they asked me to throw out the first pitch, so he said, "I'm going to come back to get you in about an hour." 30 minutes before first pitch, around 5:30 or something. And I wasn't the only person. There were two other people who were also throwing out the first pitch, and I was the second person to do it, which made me a little bit less anxious. Um, I mean, like I said, I wasn't so anxious for the hour before, but then when I was walking on the field, I was kind of just like, I don't want to mess up here or not follow directions. So that was helpful that I wasn't the first person. I was second. So I listened to what they were telling me to do, where to go, when, and just tried to copy what the first person did. And I'm interested to see the video and the picture too, which I haven't gotten yet. But it short hopped, I believe. So I'm mostly relieved and proud of myself that I largely got it over the plate. I think it was pretty
Yeah.
accurate, just a little short, but no Barack Obama bouncing it halfway.
That was Aaron Fischman. His book, A Baseball Gaijin, Chasing a Dream to Japan and Back, is out now. We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. You can support us on Patreon. Until next time,